Tonight we return to the subject of Plato's Republic, and we're on Book 6. Book 6 will deal with ontology and the structure of reality and how we know things. So this will be Plato's epistemology and his metaphysics. And as we saw last time in the last talk, we discussed the levels of knowledge and that some people love opinions and others love the truth. Philosophers love and follow what's true and know what's true, whereas the majority of people love opinion and mass perception. And that's what determines what's so-called true for them. Now, we're going to get pretty deep tonight, so in a brief overview of Book 6, we're going to be talking about the Philosopher King and why it is that the ideal city or republic should be run by the Philosopher King, and how suitable is this, how realistic can we actually get a Philosopher King. And Plato's going to point out that only philosophers, as we said, have knowledge, and that alone is sufficient to qualify them to be the rulers. And that's provided, of course, that they aren't inferior to the non-philosophers in virtue. So Socrates will then try to show that they are in fact supremely virtuous, that is, the true philosopher. And then Adamantius will accept the arguments, but he will point out that the majority of people, they just simply go on believing that philosophers are not suited to be rulers, because they know from experience that most philosophers, this is the general popular view of the philosopher, is that they're kind of these vicious, unruly, argumentative, worthless types. And with there only being a few decent ones. Now, Socrates actually will agree with this, that the majority of philosophers actually are worthless flim-flam men and have no business doing what they do. I would agree. The people that the majority of humans, even in Plato's day, the people they take to be philosophers actually are vicious, useless people. But that is, of course, because the few decent ones who actually do possess the philosophical nature are actually not raised under the right sort of state or constitution in Plato's mind to where true philosophy can actually flourish. So the point then will be, if the majority ever saw a real philosopher, who had been properly bred and trained in virtue and so forth, then they would agree that this person should be the ruler of the city because he would be the wisest man. And certainly you would want the wisest man to be the ruler of your city and not the fools, because in situations of warfare or great stress, times of peril, you want wise people in charge and not the fools, or else the whole place will collapse. And as we said, the guardians must also, in quite an exact sense, be philosophic. Now, even though philosophy is not the primary goal of the guardians, there's a kind of graded hierarchy, or sort of a grade of being, chain of being, by which we rise up to the top of the Philosopher King. And so for the masses at the bottom, philosophy is not what they have to worry about. And then for the guardian class above them, they should be more philosophical. And then above them, the Philosopher King should be solely focused on philosophy. And that's how they'll be the best rulers. And as we rise up through these ranks, it's the virtues become more important. And this is where we're going to come to the issue of the line, geometry, and the analogy of the sun, which will be crucial for understanding Platonism and Platonic epistemology. Now, what's funny is that the beginning of this talk describes the Sophists. And the Sophists, of course, are the pseudo-philosophers, those who appeal to the masses, the pop philosopher who appeals to the mass by telling them what they want to hear. And it's precisely because the Sophists, who are the relativists of their day, because they don't understand philosophy, they're kind of shills, we might say. They're kind of propagandists. They're kind of sophomoric do-it-yourselfers who, gadflies that latch on to a couple ideas here and there and use a few terms, and then they sound very philosophical. They sound reasonable. And so there's an interesting statement that I'll read here. Do you think then that there's any difference between the blind and those who are really deprived of the knowledge of each thing that is? The latter have no clear model in their souls, and so they cannot, in the matter of painters, look towards what is most true, make constant reference to it, and study it as exactly as possible. Hence they cannot establish here on earth conventions about what is fine or just or good, when they need to be established or guard or preserve them once they have been established. So in order for knowledge to be disseminated, it comes down through a proper hierarchy according to Plato and Socrates. And because the Sophists are the fake philosophers, the phony balonies, crisis actor philosophers, they're not appropriate for the task. And they, in fact, then lead to the corruption of the city. People are misled, and they don't understand what philosophy really is or what it's about. And so we have a statement again that let's agree that philosophic natures, that is, the natures of people who are actually into philosophy and understand it, always love this sort of learning that makes clear to them the feature of the being that always is and does not wander about between coming to be and decaying, right? So the notion of being and becoming, the philosopher for Plato studies being, the true being, what is, not what's in constant change and flux, and you're not led about by the baubles and trinkets, you're not shifted in your beliefs and in your knowledge by the changing opinions of man, because men's opinions throughout history are constantly subject to change. But there are certain things that do not change. For example, geometric principles, right angles, things like this. And this is what Plato will use as an analogy to show that there is objective, ideational, noetic knowledge that doesn't change. And that this is the ground and starting point for true metaphysics and true being and true knowledge. The Sophists, the fake philosophers, the materialists, people, other like alternative media, so-called philosophers out there who teach materialism, they're not real philosophers, precisely because they teach that empiricism is the end, is the result, the road to true knowledge, and that's the lowest form of knowledge, in fact. And so Plato, in fact, deals with that very issue here. And so the problem of the world and everyday space-time is not where we really get truth. Now, we do learn things from everyday space-time flux and the realm of becoming, but the realm of becoming is a medium, which points us to the higher realm, the realm of the intelligible world, the celestial realm, where things don't change, where 2 times 2 equals 4, regardless of how many pairs there are in front of you, right? If you have 4 pairs and the pairs rot over time, does that mean that 2 plus 2 no longer equals 4 because there's no empirical sense data of 2 plus 2 equaling 4? Of course not. And that's because 2 plus 2 equaling 4 is not determined by, bound by, or connected to in a necessary way to any specific instantiations or examples of 2 objects and 2 objects and 4 objects. This should be obvious, but the Sophists can't get this, or they don't want to. Sense experience is and can be quite illusory, but 2 times 2 equaling 4 is not illusory. And so it's funny then that he talks about the falsehood that is perpetuated by the Sophists. They must refuse to accept what is false, hate it, and then have a love for the truth. And that's the problem with the Sophist, is that he doesn't love truth. Loving truth is a virtue. And the Sophist, by his very nature, doesn't care and is fine with lies. And because he's fine with lies and has no love for the truth, he doesn't discover the truth. And so he's perpetually trapped in a realm of deception, phantasms, and empirical lies. The philosopher is not concerned ultimately with his bodily pleasures. But if you're an empiricist, if you're a materialist, then all there is bodily pleasures, right? That's ultimately the highest goal, is the, in some form or fashion, pleasing the body. That's all there is. There's no soul, there's nothing beyond this life. And so if that's the case, then material comforts and bodily pleasure are really all there is. And if that's all there is, then it follows that truth doesn't really matter, because there's nothing compelling you to believe in one thing over another thing. It doesn't matter. Why believe in truth or seek truth unless there's something eternal about it, something unchanging, and thereby directing oneself towards the highest good, the eternal good, and the form of good. Now, in theology, this would, of course, be God. And so this is why Platonism can be insightful for understanding theology. It's not ultimately the right theology. So for those who think that mistakenly I'm a Platonist, no. I would have to correct you there. I'm not a Platonist. It's just that the aspects of the metaphysics and the epistemology here are insightful for understanding theology. And theology is true philosophy. Interestingly, Plato will say that theology is what philosophy ultimately is too. Plato's conception of God, or the God, however, is quite different from what we would take to be the kind of God presented, say, in the Bible. Now, since the philosopher cannot be a person who's avaricious, greedy, a lover of money, a lover of popularity and fame, can't ultimately care about those things. If they come, so be it. If not, so be it. Because the philosopher's main concern is what's true. And therefore, that's why for Platonism you can't divorce ethics from metaphysics. If you could, then you could have people who are completely evil, wicked, and destructive who know what's true and are therefore guides to the rest of men. But you can't love falsehood and love truth at the same time. Those are impossibilities. And so we're kind of pulled in both directions as fallen humans, and we either go more so in one direction or more so in the other direction. And over time, the way that we choose to live then will affect the consequences of those actions. The philosopher is not concerned with death. He is, of course, righteous, as we saw in the Apology, and not worried about such matters, because he knows that if he's chosen truth and lived aright, then death is nothing to be afraid of. Because one is only afraid of death when one has a preponderance of material attachments, and the only thing that would cause a preponderance of material attachments would be materialistic philosophy. The philosopher is not petty. He doesn't care about being ripped off for $5 or for having something ill said of him in passing. The philosopher is above pettiness. And as we said, is not greedy or avaricious, but is concerned with knowledge or noetic light. Now, what is noetic light? Well, we'll find out here in a minute. The philosopher should also be of quality memory. Right? He should have a good power of recollection and reminiscence and memory. This will be required for the job of teaching and progressing in knowledge. The qualities, of course, will ultimately culminate in the ability to rule men wisely, because not all men have the exact same constitution, so to speak. They're not all fitted to rule. Some men are leaders, others are not. Men who are leaders are men who follow virtue and live aright and are able to lead others into truth, right? And this is kind of natural. We see this in the natural kingdom with certain animals being so-called alphas, right? And it's an analogy for the realm of teaching knowledge and philosophy for Plato. Now, most people think of philosophers as these useless, rambling windbags who don't really do anything but kind of sell themselves to gain a following and then, in some way try to be popular or make money or whatever it is that their particular vice might be. And certainly there's good reason to think that, and Plato agrees. There's so many sophists out there and people who think that they're philosophers. However, they do not actually know philosophy. They're stargazers, babblers, and good-for-nothings, we're told. And much the same happens in theology as well, where people believe that they're biblical scholars. They believe they've discovered some true gnosis, or they're just outright bamboozlers and out to make a buck. Now, these are not the goals of the true philosopher. And it becomes evident over time, because truth kind of ultimately has its own staying power. It has its own inherent sufficiency, self-sufficiency to speak directly to the reason of other human beings. Now, unfortunately, not all human beings utilize the faculty of reason that they have appropriately, and that's why not all men are philosophers. But on this topic, we read, "The natural thing is for the sick person, rich or poor, to go to the doctor. For anyone who needs to be ruled, to go to the ruler. It isn't for the ruler, if he's truly of any use, to beg others to accept him. It's not for the doctor to beg others to take him. If he's good, it'll happen." And it's the same way with philosophy, right? We don't have to worry so much about all the sophists and bullshitters out there, because the truth will ultimately convince people in the end. And time vindicates the truth. The philosopher must hate falsehood, and this is why virtue is intimately connected to knowledge and metaphysics. This is an argument I've made many times, that you can't divorce these topics. And of course it's very popular in modernity, especially since the Enlightenment and the alterations of pedagogy throughout the last couple hundred years, especially with the Prussian and then Western socialist notions of education and what socialist education is supposed to be. And in that mindset, education is broken down into all of these disparate units that are not connected to one another. Biology has nothing to do with philosophy. Geometry and mathematics have nothing to do with, literature, right? But in the older idea of the Middle Ages of the university, the meaning of the term itself encapsulates the fact that the whole of the universe is a unified exemplification of divine wisdom, providence, foreknowledge, and ultimately divine presence. And that's why modern education and modern pedagogy are actually designed to be corrupting and to have people compartmentalized ultimately into little boxes where they aren't able by design to make connections between fields, and thereby unify all of their philosophies and then understand that it's ultimately theology. A devilish trick, to be sure. The philosopher needs to have a good upbringing. Upbringing is crucial. This is timeless, perennial wisdom. Everybody should know this. However, in our egalitarian, socialistic, leftist, modern context, we don't understand this to be important, because we think that everything is ultimately the fault of our environment. Man's problem is not internal. It's not man's own heart and weakness that is the issue and lack of virtue. It's society, man. It's the man. It's the oppression of those all around us. In actuality, blame can only be laid at the heart of the individual himself for failure to be knowledgeable within one's own due station, of course. Now, good upbringing, being well bred, this is a topic that will carry over into Aristotle as well. Aristotle will agree with Plato that being well bred is crucial to what it is to be a proper guardian and then a proper philosopher king should one rise to that rank. Nurture is crucial because people will continue as they get older to live out the programmed nurturing that they received, be it good or ill. And then, of course, people will follow their peers. And this is a problem, and it's also, unfortunately, just natural, right? People are naturally going to kind of be herd beings. They're going to follow the mass. Why? Because of simply not wanting to be left out. They want to be part of a group. They want to feel a belonging, a sense of unity, a sense of community, which is natural. There's nothing wrong with those things in my view. The problem is that you can have a corrupt society, you can have corruption come in, corrupt philosophers, corrupt leaders and so forth, corrupt education, and then the mass of people will simply follow crooks, con men, mountebanks, and sham artists. These educators and sophists impose by their actions, he says. Now, this is a great quote on the sophists, and he says, they're paid private teachers. They are the sophists, and they are rivals in the craft. They teach anything other than the convictions. They will not teach anything other than the convictions that the majority express. Indeed, they are precisely what this is precisely what sophists call wisdom. Wisdom is mass opinion, according to them. Think of Darwinism. Well, it's true because everybody believes it. All the scientists, so-called, believe it. It must be true. That's sophism. It's as if someone were learning the moods and appetites, Socrates says, of a huge beast, and that is he's rearing, how to handle it, how to hold it, how to train it, right? And through tending this beast over time, he calls this knack for leading the beast wisdom. He gathers himself much information as if this were a craft and starts to teach it. Think of social engineering, right? Think of the Dawkinites and Darwinians and materialists and empiricists who lead the masses out around like a beast with a nuzzle, right? Or the ass with a carrot in front of him. He knows nothing about what these convictions are. He knows nothing of what's good or bad, shameful or just. He just applies all these terms to how the beast reacts. So what is bad? Whatever people don't like. What's good? Whatever people like. Right? Think of the fast-talking con man, the flim-flam guy. Right? That's sort of the monetary equivalent, the business equivalent of the sophist. Plato says that these views are completely ridiculous, right? So, I mean, how do we show that? Well, if the majority of people say that 2 plus 2 is 5, then that makes it so, right? But we obviously think that's ridiculous. We know that's not true, right? It doesn't matter how many people come to the conclusion that 2 plus 2 is 5. It's just simply not. And so this is an obvious demonstration of something you would think would be obvious, but to most people caught in relativism, caught in subjectivism, they can't seem to think outside of themselves. They can't seem to think about something being objective. They can't seem to think about the possibility of how ridiculous that is, even when you demonstrate it. And this is why Socrates says, keep this in mind, that the majority in no way tolerate, accept the reality of beauty itself. Right? The majority out there, the masses, they're not going to understand the form of beauty or the form of good. They're not going to understand that there's a higher realm where things are objectively and unchangingly and eternally true. Why is that? Because the majority cannot be philosophic. They cannot. Hence, they inevitably disapprove of those who practice philosophy. Absolutely, he says. And so, do all of these sophists who associate with the majority then just try to please them? Yep. There you go. That's how society is run. And the nature of the philosopher, though, he says, cannot be corrupted, right? Because the philosopher has seen truth, and he knows that there's truth. And he knows that 2 + 2 is 4. It's not altered or changed by mass opinion. It just is. And that there's a whole bunch of implications that then follow from this. Well, I should say that, to be clear, the true philosopher ultimately, who truly is the true philosopher, can't be corrupted if he perseveres in loving the truth. Philosophers, though, can be, unfortunately, corrupted. And that's one danger, of course. And he says that the philosophy of Athens in his day was just completely degenerate, and there was, I guess, needing in some sense of a philosophic revival, so to speak. And he talks about the pride and arrogance of the youth who think that they're philosophers when they're not. And we see this quite often in internet philosophers, right, who've had no philosophic training, but read a few books and sophomorically think that they're philosophic experts. As a result, he says, won't he exalt himself to great heights and be brimming with pretension and pride that is empty and lacks wisdom and understanding? He certainly will. If someone approaches a young man in that condition and gently tells him truth, that there's no understanding, unless he works laboriously like a slave to attain it, then he will fall into many evils. Yes, and that is the truth. And I can only tell other philosophers out there, and I don't claim to have completely obtained to truth. I think I've obtained to a measure of truth by God's gift, by God's grace. And I would say that to those aspiring to truth, it is laborious. And Basil the Great says much the same thing in his theological treatises, and it's been my experience, I guess 14 or 15 years into, well, no, actually, I guess it would be 16 years into studying philosophy now. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, but the payoff is worth it. And so there's an interesting discussion next about the way that the sophists will view things in life, and this harkens back to things that we saw in the Apology in the beginning of the book of the beginning of the Republic, book 1 and 2. And he says there are many ways that the philosophic and best nature can be corrupted and destroyed, and he says that this can happen to an individual, and it can happen to the collective, to the city as well. And he says that when you get a bunch of people who are sophists teaching philosophy, like we have at the state schools now, and they fall away from Sophia, divine wisdom, and they leave her desolate and unwed, they lead themselves then lives that are inappropriate and untrue. Well, what do we see from the great universities out there in so-called academia, Princeton, Harvard, Yale? We see the liberal arts and philosophy departments teaching things like Peter Singer, teaching killing babies at age 3, which unfortunately is also a Platonic idea. We see bestiality, we see all sorts of degeneration coming out of these so-called schools of philosophy and liberal arts, as a weaponized strategy of social destruction, social engineering, to break down what is and to rebuild it into the new technocratic state. And I would point out too the similarity here with Solomon's Proverbs. If you've never read Solomon's Proverbs out there, if you're listening to this, I highly recommend that. In fact, I would even say, before going further in Plato's Republic, to stop and read the 32 chapters of Solomon's Proverbs. I think that that's a better place even to start about wisdom, right? That's what the Proverbs are about. They're kind of a catechetical introduction to wisdom and wisdom literature from King Solomon. This is the free half of my lecture on Plato's Republic, Book 6. For the rest of the Plato talks, as well as my past archives, go to jaysanalysis.com and you can subscribe there at the PayPal subscription link, where I send out my philosophical talks and lectures for those who are so inclined. Thank you for listening.